delighted to welcome Quentin Kidd, PhD from Christopher Newport University, to This Week in Virginia. Quentin, and I guess I'll say Quentin because we've been friends for a long time, is Dean of the College of Social Sciences and also the academic director of the Wason Center for Civic Leadership. Hopefully everyone has seen that new name. It's fairly new, Wason Center for Civic Leadership at Christopher Newport. So we're delighted to have you on to talk about some of the surveys. We'll put the Wason Center website up as well as one where they can reach you. And I was amazed to, I didn't look at all of them, but to see over 30 surveys that were there that are accessible and public can go on and can go back to 1917 at least and can see those surveys. So I think Angel has a question or two to start us off, and then I will ask some, and then we'll just turn you loose to give us some great information. So Angel, you start.
Thank you. How do you conduct these surveys?
So these are live call surveys. So the classic, what I would think of as the gold standard for survey research. It's a live call survey. We have a survey research lab on campus. We have about 100 students that are trained to do the kind of research calling that we're doing. They've got to go through all of the training to be prepared to do it and meet all of the ethical guidelines that are established by the federal government. So it's a well-run operation, and it's also an operation that's run by students. So a first or second year student might start by doing the calling, and then they move up to being a manager, a shift manager, and then the lab manager. So the entire survey research operation, the lab itself, on a night-to-night basis is run by students. Clearly, if there's a problem, they'll call me or my colleague, Dr. Bromley Trujillo, who is the survey research lab director. But it's all run by students. Now, we design the surveys and we draw the sample of respondents. So if we're doing a registered voter survey, then we draw the sample of registered voters in Virginia. If we're doing just sort of a citizen survey, then we'll draw a sample of a random digit dial sample of any telephone number in Virginia. So, and then the students call and basically ask the person that answers the phone, would you be willing to give me 5 or 8 minutes of your time to answer a few questions about Virginia public policy or Virginia elections? And so we typically try to complete between 800 and 1,000 interviews per project, which allows us to do the kind of analysis that we do in the reports that we do, but it also allows us to do a little bit of crosstab analysis, so we can look at the differences across race or gender or region of the state, so long as we have more than 800 completed interviews. So that's the basic model of how we do this.
Okay. Go ahead.
Did you have another question, Angel?
You mentioned that you make sure that there's diversity in there in the surveys, but how do you make sure that it is diverse amongst each pool?
So there are two ways that you can ensure diversity, in the sense that you're matching the characteristics, the demographic characteristics of Virginia. So we know from census data, and we have some wonderful institutions in Virginia that keep our census, our census data up to track every year. So the Weldon Cooper Center does some wonderful census work every year. So we know what Virginia looks like demographically. We know what percentage of Virginia is male or female, where Virginians live regionally, what percentage is, Black, white, other race or ethnicity. And so one of the ways we can ensure that we're representing Virginia is we can build in quotas up front. So we program the system so that, I say, look, I know that there are 19% African Americans in Virginia. So as we're doing our calling, we want to make sure that we reach 19% of African Americans. And once we do, then we want to make sure that we're reaching other racial and ethnic groups. And so we'll meet that quota, if you will. Another way to do it is to back in weight the results once we've completed the survey. So let's say our goal is to interview 5% Hispanic Virginians, but let's say we only get to 3%. So on the back end, we may weight the 3% up to equal 5%. So there are two ways that we can reflect Virginia's demographics. One is the quota up front, and another one is by weighting on the back end. And so we will do one or both of those so that when we put out a survey, we can say we're reflecting the demographic characteristics of the Commonwealth as accurately as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you very much for laying that out. Looking at your most recent survey, it came out the last week in February. I was struck by one of the observations that you made about the new lost cause. Being a Virginia native, and you and your many years that you've spent in Virginia, we know about the lost cause. But the new lost cause, for people who didn't see that quote or maybe are wondering, what in the world are you talking about, Dr. Kidd? What's the new lost cause as you're identifying it?
So what made me think about that is that at a time when Virginia, like many other parts of the country, seems to be dismantling the infrastructure of the lost cause, which was the lost Civil War, by taking down monuments and other figures that represented the Civil War and what the Civil War meant to people back then. The monuments and the memorials, for example. While that part of history is being dismantled in many ways, out of the 2020 election comes what in some ways is the new lost cause, and that is, the presidential election of 2020, where Donald Trump lost by several million votes, but he and his supporters essentially claimed that they didn't lose, that they really won. I mean, even this last weekend, the former president was declaring that he really won a landslide victory. And so what made me think about that is, in that most recent survey, Senator Amanda Chase, who's one of the Republican candidates for governor, is essentially running on the idea that the election was stolen, the 2020 election was stolen, that Donald Trump really won, and that there's rampant fraud that cost him the election. And so, and it's not just Amanda Chase. If you listen to some of the other candidates, like Glenn Youngkin gave an interview recently where he wouldn't admit that Joe Biden was elected, president, without any real fraud. And other candidates running for governor on the Republican side are hesitating on that question. And they're hesitating probably not because they maybe believe it themselves, but they know that there's a ton of Republican supporters out there, rank and file Republican voters, that do feel that way. And so that's what I was referencing, sort of the new lost cause. At the very time when the old lost cause is being dismantled in Virginia, there emerges perhaps a new lost cause. And look, Senator Chase is leading among Republican voters, among voters who identify as Republicans. She's leading the field right now. Even though Republicans aren't going to have a primary, we wanted to survey what Republican voters were thinking, and she's leading among Republican voters. And so that feeling, that emotion that she expresses is widespread among Republican voters. And so that was what I was getting at with the new lost cause phrase.
One of your scholarly works in the book was The Rational Southerner. I wonder if rational needs something IR in front of it as we think about it. When I think about how long the lost cause survived, and then I think there may be a new lost cause, it kind of gives one pause as to wonder how long it would last. And I feel confident in some of your future surveys, and maybe some others who are doing surveys in Virginia too, will be able to see, does that number shift any of the ones, because I think you probably have it on the top of your head, but only 60-some%, I believe, of Virginians think that President Biden's election was valid.
That's right. That's right. A third of registered voters in Virginia don't think that Joe Biden's election was valid, was legitimate. That's a huge number. And especially when there's no evidence at all of any widespread irregularities, and everywhere it's been, studied and examined, every state, people, the people who have done the study and analysis say there's no widespread fraud has been litigated in court. And so multiple times, 60 times, I believe, cases. Nevertheless, a third of Virginia voters, largely Republicans, say Biden was probably not legitimately elected president. That's a huge number, which now, how long that sentiment lasts, how long how long that sentiment governs or drives Virginia Republican politics is anybody's guess. But right now, a third of Virginians feel that way.
In your most recent survey, and then there were a couple just before that. So in the last 3 months, I guess you've had at least 3 surveys. Is there something else? I'm thinking this may be one, but something else that kind of jumped out at you that you or your team conducting the survey, your director and others were saying, "Oh, I wouldn't have seen that coming." Were there any surprises, or did it, for the most part, kind of confirm what you might have expected to find?
In some ways, yes. What we've been demonstrating among Virginians' views over the last several months are consistent with kind of where they've been for the last several years. Virginia Democrats are largely unified around some of the big issues that Democrats are pushing or have been pushing in the General Assembly: decriminalization of marijuana, for example, police reform, things like that. And so we didn't find any big changes or any big surprises in that survey or in those surveys when we looked at Democrats in Virginia. And quite frankly, we didn't find any massive surprises among Republicans, because in part, what we're finding in Virginia among Republicans is what we're finding among Republicans nationally. There's still a strong attraction to Donald Trump. There's still a strong attraction to the populist kind of anti-establishment sentiment among Republican voters that we see nationally. That sentiment exists in Virginia. And I would argue to some extent that sentiment has kind of controlled Republican politics in Virginia for 10 or 15 years now. And I don't see it breaking or waning in any of our current polling. And I think that's a real existential question that Republicans have to sort of address over the next election cycle or a few, is, how do they come to grips with where their base is versus where Virginia is generally? Because I think that's part of the reason Republicans haven't been successful statewide since 2009, is that their base, the median Republican in Virginia, is so far away from the median voter in Virginia that they can't produce candidates that can be attractive to both the median voter and the median Republican. And that's kind of their problem. So we'll see whether that changes this cycle. So no big surprises, but rather I would argue kind of a consistent picture that has been painted about Democrats and Republicans in Virginia over the last several years. The one thing I would say that seems to be moving a little bit is that Democrats in Virginia are becoming more progressive. They are moving left. And so that could spell problems for Democrats in the future because, again, both parties have to be close enough to the median voter in Virginia to attract them in a general election. Republicans have been too far away recently. Democrats could very well move too far away. And so, I'm looking at that as we go forward, like where are Republicans and where are Democrats relative to what I would call the median voter in Virginia, because that's where elections are won.
It'll be interesting to see how many of the members of the House of Delegates who are Democrats get challenges from the left in a Democratic primary. I know that's happening some. I don't know how much, and it will be interesting to see if challenged by someone to the left, more progressive, however you want to describe it. What will the primary voters decide? Do they want to keep the incumbent, who may be somewhat moderate, or do they want to get someone more progressive? So that will be interesting. Let me move to another subject, because toward the end of December in your survey, you found that I think it was 64% of the Virginia voters with school-age children were somewhat satisfied or somewhat satisfied with how COVID and school returning to school is being handled. And at the same time, it was a pretty high number. I'm looking at it. 75% of the voters with school-age children were either very concerned or somewhat concerned that their children were falling behind. Um, that has been an issue, as we know, and as people who followed the General Assembly know, that was discussed practically every day in the Senate of Virginia and sometimes in the House of Delegates, to say kids need to be back in school. Um, do you think that the sentiment of the voters was really being heard by the legislators? Or comment some on that, on what you found about getting back in the classroom and yet being safe at the same time?
Right. I don't see these two views of voters as contradictory views. One can be largely satisfied that the local school district or the state is doing the best it can in the context of a pandemic, but still be concerned that their own child or that children generally are falling behind as it relates to education. Those aren't necessarily contradictory views. I do think, however, among a small but very vocal segment of voters, there is a sense that schools have been held out too long, that as evidence mounts about how the coronavirus transmits among younger people, that it's not as dangerous, et cetera, that schools should be back in session. And so you see largely Republican candidates right now running essentially on reopen the schools. And so I think there's a Republicans clearly see an opening there for an issue. I don't think in December when we did that poll, the opening was necessarily there. But I do believe that as we move into spring, as the vaccination process speeds up, as more and more people become vaccinated, I do think the opportunity, just speaking politically, to make that issue more profound on the campaign trail, and to draw the contrast of views of voters versus what's happening becomes more available to candidates who want to make that case. And look, the pressure is on, I think, for schools to reopen, especially as the vaccination becomes more widespread, as vaccinations become more widespread. And so it's an issue right now, or in December, it was an issue among, I think, a smaller segment of voters in Virginia. But I think as time goes on, if schools don't reopen, then it becomes an issue among a broader segment of voters in Virginia. But let me say this: if the most optimistic things we're hearing about the vaccine and the extent to which people are going to be vaccinated by midsummer come true, my sense is that schools will be open in the fall, and will be as close to back to normal as one could imagine us being able to be. And so then I don't know that it becomes a big issue on the campaign trail in the fall. So I think the reason you hear Republican candidates, and I'm thinking in particular of like Kirk Cox and Pete Snyder, I see them talk about this a lot, reopening the schools, is because it's really playing most powerfully right now among Republican voters, Republican constituents. But I think that it plays more broadly as we go on. But then it becomes a non-issue in the fall when schools are opened. I don't know that voters are necessarily going to hold a candidate who wasn't in office responsible for something that the governor had done back early in the spring or didn't do back early in the spring. So I don't know that it carries through to the fall as an issue, unless schools aren't open. Then I think it becomes a really powerful issue and Democrats in particular, since Democrats control government in Virginia, are really going to be on the ropes to explain why they're not able to reopen schools.
You know, I live in Henrico County, and I talk with parents of some school-aged children who decided last fall they would go virtual. Now they would like to go in person, but cannot. And I don't know how much that is occurring throughout the Commonwealth. I understand school divisions, superintendents, and everyone, they have to plan for a certain number of students in school, but there's sort of a catch-22 in a way for parents who were being cautious in the fall, but now, even at this point in March, would say, yes, I wish my 11th grader was back in high school. I think he'd be doing better. But he can't. He can't say, oh, now I got my hand up. I want to come back into classroom. He can't do it. So that's another challenge that's not so much a political one, but just, I guess, a practical one. Let me move to another subject area. Back in the late fall, you had on your surveys about people who were satisfied or dissatisfied with the direction the country was going. You've continued to poll some on that, and that has shifted. Do you attribute the shift predominantly to the presidential election or to other factors? But it is a fairly significant number that you can see difference.
Yeah, we've been polling on direction of the Commonwealth and direction of the country since, for the last 15 years. And the sense of the direction of the country went way down almost immediately upon the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And it never really recovered. It always hovered in the high teens to low to mid 20% in terms of right direction, wrong direction. This is a right direction. So it was always, twice as many respondents saying wrong direction as right direction during the Trump presidency. And then the first time we surveyed this post Joe Biden being sworn in as president, it went up to around 50%, right below 50%. And so the right direction, wrong direction numbers of the country essentially evened out. And I attribute it all to the election of Joe Biden. There wasn't enough time really for Joe Biden to have done anything in terms of policy when we were in the field with that survey. And so I attribute it to a strong distaste for Donald Trump among a lot of Virginia voters who were happy that he was out of office. And so they were more comfortable with the direction of the country because they were more comfortable with Joe Biden as president. And I would say this, Donald Trump lost Virginia in 2016 by 5 points. And his loss in Virginia grew in 2020. And so, I think you can, if there's some things that you can confidently say about Virginia voters, a majority of Virginia voters never did like Donald Trump. They didn't like him in 2016, and they didn't like him even more in 2020. And so the idea that they would be unhappy with the direction of the country under Donald Trump's leadership and more happy under the leadership of Joe Biden isn't too surprising. The question is, what does Joe Biden do as president, and how do Virginia voters respond to that going forward? Are they comfortable with him as president and the policy decisions he makes going forward or not? And only time will tell on that one.
Dr. Quentin Kidd, before our time's up, is there something else that you want to leave with us about the results of some of the polls? We'll send people to those sites where they can see the last 30 some and can review them. Anything else that you would like to share with us?
I would just say they're out there. The purpose for us doing these and making them available to the public is so that everybody has a sense of what Virginians are thinking, and hopefully it contributes positively to the civic discourse in the Commonwealth. That's our purpose. I recognize that polling is a controversial area right now. Lots of people are discussing polling and whether it's helping or hurting. Our purpose is to help. The way we do our polls is transparent. The way we conduct them, the way we weight them, et cetera. So it's all out there. And I would just say, if anybody had questions, send me an email. I get, a dozen emails every time we put out a poll, some of them really critical, some of them just asking questions. And I take it as an educational opportunity. I have exchanged emails with people that I didn't know, just who were out around the Commonwealth and had legitimate questions about how polling was done. And we would go back and forth for 2 or 3 weeks with me explaining what we do. So I would welcome those opportunities because that's a part of what we're doing, as an educational institution, not only working with our students, but working with the larger public as well.
We thank you very much, Dr. Quentin Kidd, for being on This Week in Virginia. If my co-host Angel Miner were not a senior at VCU, if she were a senior in high school, I'd be telling her, take a look at the Wason Center for Civic Leadership Scholarship. I see on your site in 21 there's going to be scholarships, so we'll hope some parents of some high schoolers will be looking at that, and we'll be checking that out. And thank you so much for being on This Week in Virginia, and we look forward to your next poll also.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.